Hi everyone. Laudetur Jesus Christus in saecula saeculorum. Amen. Okay, so this is my first lecture on on the Way of Perfection by Saint Teresa of Avila. It's part of a 10 lecture series, and let me begin by telling you that this is going to be a work in progress. I'm in formation right now, so I'm not only learning about Carmelite spirituality, but I'm also growing in it. And undoubtedly, in the future, when I look back at these lectures, I'll see things that I've missed and probably want to update. And so I'm just making you aware of that. That this is just the way that I learn the material. I find it very useful for me to organize a lecture. It forces me to organize the material and to present it in a coherent fashion, and this helps to really incorporate that material into my own understanding of Carmelite spirituality. Okay, just keep that in mind as we go through this. I am going to try to use text to speech for the quotes. I have quotes from the text, and rather than me reading them, it's kind of hard to read off of the screen. I'm going to actually just use text to speech. It seems to work quite well. It'll break up my voice as well. Okay, so just be aware of that. And of course, you can follow along in the lecture. That's the whole point of the lecture. But if you want to see my notes, I've put them up on a blog, and I'll have that blog exclusively for this for these lecture series. Okay, and so there's the address, and I'll try to put that address in the description below afterwards. Okay, so whoops, let's begin here. And as I said, the text is The Way of Perfection by St. Teresa of Avila. It was translated by Father Kavanaugh and Father Rodriguez, OCD. They were Carmelite friars, okay? And we'll be looking at the study edition, which was prepared by Father Kavanaugh, and it's published in ICS Publications, and there's the ISBN number. I'll try to show you the text here. There it is. Okay, try not to get any glare. Okay, and as you can see here, it's the study edition. Okay, of The Way of Perfection. All right. So the text begins with a very long introduction by Father Kavanaugh. It's excellent, and I strongly recommend you reading it. It contextualizes the work and speaks about some of the historical background to the text and how the text evolved over time and so on. I'm not going to go through all those details right now, but I do want to bring up one point, and that is that there were two versions that Father Kavanaugh and Father Rodriguez incorporated together. There was the main text, the Valladolid text, and then there was an expanded Escorial text, okay? And they were actually able to put the two together and indicate what had come from the Escorial text, okay? And so I'll just read the quote from you, or have the text to speech read the quote for you from Father Kavanaugh.
We have indicated whatever is taken from Escorial and introduced into our main text from Valladolid by enclosing it in brackets. Where there are two versions of the same passage, yet with significant differences, we give a translation of the Escorial version in a note.
Okay, actually, in this particular lecture, which goes over chapters, the prologue in chapters 1 through 4, I actually did not have to use anything from the Escorial text. Nonetheless, when I do in these lecture series, I'll make sure that I point that out. Okay. And before we jump in, the next thing you need to know is, how big is this text? It's not that long. It's actually a prologue and 42 short chapters. Okay, and in like I said, in this particular series, I'll just go over the prologue and the chapters 1 through 4. Okay, so the prologue here, uh, Saint Teresa begins explaining why she wrote The Way of Perfection. Okay, and it turns out that she founded a monastery, St. Joseph's, and the sisters at that monastery heard that she had written her autobiography. Okay, but her censor, Father Banyas, felt that the text, that work wasn't appropriate for the sisters. Okay, it was a little bit too spicy for them. It had some of Saint Teresa's mystical experiences, and these were not. They felt these were not appropriate for nuns, and so the nuns pressed Saint Teresa to write them a book, to write something about prayer, and so she wrote the Way of Perfection. Okay, and she felt that she did it out of obedience to her sisters. All right, so let me read the quote there.
The sisters have known that I received permission to write some things about prayer. The sisters have urged me so persistently to tell them something about it that I have decided to obey them.
All right. So before I actually get into the thick of the text, I do want to say something about how St. Teresa wrote, okay? By her own admission, she was not a systematic writer. And as a result, reading the text, you might wonder what's going on because she'll often jump from one thing to another, okay? And you can conjecture about what the connection might be, but it's not obvious, it's not explicit in the text, okay? And the danger here is, and it's a danger I easily fall into, is to want to over systematize the text and trying to make sense of it all, and you just have to resist that. But it's okay because each one of these themes that she goes over, they're of value in and of themselves, even if they are abstracted from the text. So although there is a flow, even if you can't follow the flow at times, it's all right because at any particular point, Saint Teresa will be discussing some issue that, or some spiritual point, which is of value in and of itself. Okay, and it can be read an abstraction from the rest of the text. So just be aware of that. And here's Saint Teresa herself telling you that that this is going to be a little bit disorderly. Okay.
Since I don't know what I'm going to say, I cannot say it in an orderly way. I believe this lack of order is best since writing this book is a thing already so out of order for me.
All right. Okay. So let's get into chapter 1. All right. It may seem strange, but she begins chapter 1 by describing the Protestant Revolution, Reformation that was going on at the time. Okay, and this was a very bitter moment in church history. It was a bitter moment in European history, which eventually led to wars in Europe. And Saint Teresa felt that the Reformation was betraying Christ. All right, and was felt compelled to do something about it, and said, "Well, I'm just going to resolve to do what little I can do about it," and that was to strive for spiritual perfection, to pray for the church, and to urge her sisters to do the same. Okay, so here's the quote there.
The news of the Lutherans in France distressed me greatly. I resolved to do the little that was in my power, to follow the evangelical counsels as perfectly as I could and strive that these few persons who live here do the same. Since we would all be occupied in prayer for those who are the defenders of the Church, we could help as much as possible this Lord of mine who is so roughly treated by those for whom he has done so much good. It seems these traitors would want him to be crucified again and that he have no place to lay his head.
Okay. By the way, I should add something about my quotes. You'll notice that I have ellipses in a few places, the dots that you just heard read out loud. And that's because some of these quotes are fairly long, and so I've just trimmed them down a bit, okay? Without hopefully, changing the meaning at any point. All right. So, you know, the Reformation was bitter, and Saint Teresa lamented first, as you just heard, because she felt that they were crucifying Christ a second time, and also because the souls were being lost to the Reformation. Okay, and for Saint Teresa, the well-being of souls was of such great importance that she actually made it central to the purpose of the prayers for the monastery, and she contrasted that to what some of her patrons came and asked for, which were worldly goods. Okay, and she said, "Yeah, we're going to pray for these worldly goods that people ask for, but that's not really the important thing. The really important thing is, of course, the salvation of soul and the spiritual growth and well-being of people." Okay, and so she's actually giving some kind of a purpose. So in this background of the Reformation, she's giving a purpose to the prayers, or at least locating that purpose in the economy of the souls, salvation of souls, and the church. Okay, so here's that quote.
My heart breaks to see how many souls are lost. This is why he has gathered you, my sisters, together here. This is your vocation, these must be the objects of your petitions, not, my sisters, the business matters of the world. For I laugh at and am even distressed about the things they come here to ask us to pray for, to ask His Majesty for wealth and money.
All right. Okay, in chapter 2, uh, uh, Saint Teresa actually makes a bit of a deviation. She goes off and starts to talk about poverty. And this is again typical of her writing style. You can wonder, why is she now starting to talk about poverty? A minute ago, she was talking about the Reformation and the need of prayer for the salvation of souls in that historical time. And now she's talking about poverty. And we can conjecture, so this is just conjecture on my part, but a minute ago she was talking about wealth and money because patrons were coming to the monastery and asking the sisters to pray for material prosperity, their material prosperity. Or maybe a minute ago she was also talking about the evangelical counsels, which include chastity, poverty, and obedience. Okay, and poverty being one of them. So maybe she takes an aside, and so her mind probably focused on one of these things, and then she follows through on that theme. Okay, so I point this out because this is kind of typical of how you should approach reading the Way of Perfection, or anything that Saint Teresa writes. Okay, and so let's look at what she has to say about poverty. And so to understand poverty, Saint Teresa basically counsels the sisters to center their lives exclusively on God, okay, as our greatest goods, and not worry further. Okay, let Him do the worrying, but not worry further, because everything else will fall into place. All right. Now, for someone that doesn't believe, or might be doubtful of this, and say, really, uh, you know, um, it might seem reckless to just say, center your life on God and these other things will fall into place. But St. Teresa says, no, don't worry. Even if this leads to starvation, that's fine. Okay. And that's because these are just, that evil, the starvation, is just a transient. It's not our greatest goods. Okay. And so don't become attached to these to created goods, which are of lesser value than God, which is our greatest good. Okay. And so she's asking her sisters to, really create this kind of hierarchy of values, culminating with God at the very top. Everything else will fall into place. All right.
Your eyes and your spouse. He will sustain you. Once he is pleased, those least devoted to you will give you food even though they may not want to, as you have seen through experience. If in following this advice you should die of hunger, blessed be the nuns of St. Joseph's. Leave this worrying to the one who can move all. His words are true, they cannot fail, rather, heaven and earth will fail. Let us not fail him, do not fear that he will fail you. And if sometime he should fail you, it will be for a greater good. It would be a good exchange to give up everything for the enjoyment of everlasting abundance.
Okay, so heaven and earth will fail. These are transient. Every created thing is transient, but He will not fail you. All right, so that's the eternal, and that's where we should keep our focus, and that's how she counsels her sisters. Okay, so um, she then turns and looks at spiritual freedom. Okay, and cautions us that you could be attached to the things that you have, and you can also be attached to things that you don't have. Okay, if you're worrying about where your next meal is going to come all the time, then you're not focusing on God. You're focusing on that worry about, food or whatever other needs you might have, whatever other material needs you might have. Okay. Conversely, if you have stuff, if you have too much stuff, then you could be in trouble too, because then you're worrying about all your worldly possessions, taking care of like whatever properties you might own and things like that. And that again will detract from God. Okay. And so this kind of attachment is actually detrimental to our spiritual growth, because it doesn't allow us for the spiritual freedom to put God at the center of our lives. Okay. And so she says, you shouldn't be poor in just an exterior way. You need to be inwardly poor, and that is this detachment. Okay, so she's kind of giving a sense to what it means to be poor in.
The less there is, the more carefree I become. The Lord knows that, in my opinion, it distresses me more when we have a large surplus than when we are in need. To worry about money would amount to making ourselves poor in an exterior way, but not being poor in spirit. Where there are too many cares about whether others will give us alms, sooner or later these cares will become habitual.
That habitual is actually important, because that is the attachment. Okay, so those cares could become habitual, and it's interesting. A transient care is not improper. You might have to worry about, you might say, well, what am I going to cook for lunch or something? But if it becomes something that's habitual, then it's going to become an attachment and detract from putting God at the center of our lives. Okay, so paradoxically, the poverty of spirit is precisely the kind of detachment from worldly goods that gives you power over worldly goods. Okay, so in a sense, you're actually have a wider enjoyment of worldly goods if you are detached from them. Okay, and if you're detached from them, if you're attached, then these worldly goods have power over you. Okay, and so here's her quote there.
Poverty of spirit is a good that includes within itself all the good things of the world. It gives once again to one who doesn't care about the world's good things dominion over them all. What do kings and lords matter to me if I don't want their riches, or don't care to please them, if in order to do so I would have to displease God in even the smallest thing?
So you can see that, if you're not worried about these worldly goods, then uh, kings and lords are not really going to have that much power, because you're not going to want things from them. Okay, instead you're going to be focused purely on God and worry about not displeasing Him. Probably something that was cultural in her time is Saint Teresa ties money to vainglory. In other words, showing off. Okay, showing that you have this success in the world. All right. There's some of that today too, but I can imagine how, in 16th century Spain this might have been a problem, and that itself is a kind of an attachment, because now it's not even the materials themselves, but it's now the esteem that you get from other people, and that attachment to other people's esteems is yet another kind of enslavement.
In my opinion, honor and money almost always go together. Poverty that is chosen for God alone has no need of pleasing anyone but Him.
So, a traditional understanding of spiritual poverty is humility. Okay, it's this awareness of our total dependence on God. All right, and Saint Teresa says, look, that's true, but we should still be grateful to those people who give us stuff, because God provides us through the means of other people. Okay, so miracles obviously do occur, but you don't usually see the hand of God coming down and putting a meal on your table or something like that. Okay, usually it's the goods that other people do for us is how God provides to us, and so we should be grateful to those people, even though it ultimately comes from God. And in thanking those other people, we are in a sense thanking God. Okay.
The Lord also desires that, even though it comes from Him, we show gratitude to those persons through whose means He gives this food to us. Do not be negligent about showing gratitude.
All right, so that was chapter 2, and it was, like I said, this digression onto the question of spiritual poverty. All right, so in chapter 3, uh, St. Teresa again picks up the question of the Protestant Reformation, and she begins with a metaphor. She says, look, warfare, like physical warfare. So, we often talk about a spiritual battle, but, she says, no, no, real warfare, like physical battle out on the field, that cannot stop a heresy, okay? And it certainly historically didn't, okay? Like, how do you stop an idea? You're not going to stop an idea. You might subjugate people by war, but you're not going to stop them from thinking, okay? And so she says, look, another approach is going to be needed here. And she uses the metaphor of a lord who withdraws into a stronghold. She says, imagine a lord and his entire countryside is overrun with the enemy. What's he going to do? He just withdraws into a stronghold and builds himself up there, okay? Builds up the strength inside that stronghold. And this is actually her spiritual approach. She says, look, don't just go out there and start fighting like, a bunch of mad soldiers. Withdraw and build yourselves up spiritually first, okay? And that's where the battle should begin. It should begin in that um, concentration on yourself, okay? Now, this is useful information in our own time because, as I'm recording this lecture, there's a kind of a culture war going on in the United States right now, okay? And, the temptation might be for people to just turn to a kind of activism, whereas really what they ought to be doing is looking at their own lives first, all right? And if you just like go out there and engage in some kind of activism, as you might have seen, all you're doing is just spreading your disorder to the world. You're really not fixing things. You're making things worse, okay? And so, rather than increase the chaos, follow St. Teresa's advice, withdraw and build yourself up first. Now, of course, I say build yourself up, but really, ultimately, you can't do that yourself, okay? You have some willpower, so you can start off with, some fixing of your own life, but ultimately, that has to be done by the graces of God, okay? So here's what she has to say about that.
Human forces are not sufficient to stop the spread of this fire caused by these heretics, even though people have tried to see if with the force of arms they could remedy all the evil that is making such progress. It has seemed to me that what is necessary is a different approach, the approach of a lord when in time of war his land is overrun with enemies and he finds himself restricted on all sides. He withdraws to a city that he has well fortified and from there sometimes strikes his foe. Those who are in the city, being chosen people, are such that they can do more by themselves than many cowardly soldiers can. And often victory is won in this way. At least, even though victory is not won, these chosen people are not conquered. For since they have no traitor, they cannot be conquered, unless through starvation. In this example the starvation cannot be such as to force them to surrender, to die, yes, but not to surrender.
So you remember that the salvation of souls was very important for Saint Teresa, and here you could say, the surrender is basically the loss of your soul. Okay, so dying, don't worry about that. But what's worse than the body dying is the loss of your soul. Okay, so that's her advice, and I think it's very pertinent to our particular situation today. And before I go on, her words here are critical. She says human forces are not sufficient. Now, I know that she's talking about the physical warfare in the next line, but her intuition is very keen here. She's basically saying, look, yeah, you have to focus on your own spiritual growth, but ultimately this can't come from you. Okay, ultimately this has to come from God. All right, because we're totally dependent. And so yeah, like I said a minute ago, yeah, you have you have free will. Like if you have a bad habit of overeating, you can diet, you have some strength that way. But in the very end, you can't ultimately totally fix yourself. Okay, and the reason is you yourself don't even know in which ways you're broken, and so the depth of the brokenness is very deep, and only God can ultimately fix that. Okay, and so she even says that here in this indirect way, human forces are not sufficient. All right. So the entire chapter revolves around this theme of growth in spiritual perfection, okay, in order to combat the world, okay, the evils of the world. And, I thought about this a lot. So I came up with a couple of metaphors which might be helpful to you, and here they are. Okay, so these are just my thinking. The first one is inspired by actually from the text by Father Kavanaugh, but also by St. Paul, who describes the church as the mystical body of Christ. Okay, and we're all parts of this body, each and every one of us. Okay, and so if the body has to engage in spiritual warfare, then the body must remain strong. Okay, and since you're the parts, the best way you can make the body strong is by beginning with yourself and making yourself strong. Okay, so that's going to be your contribution to the entire body, is to the health of the entire body, is by looking at attending to the health of yourself, okay, as a member of that body. Okay, or another way of thinking about this, and this was inspired by Solzhenitsyn, a quote there, which is the line between good and evil cuts through every heart. The battle against the world begins in our own heart, okay, against our own vices and our own imperfections. So if you want to start this, engage in this spiritual warfare, where do you go? You don't go out there. You begin in here, okay, and that's where it has to start. Again, always with the graces of God.
Since in neither the ecclesiastical nor the secular arm can we be of any help to our King, let us strive to be the kind of persons whose prayers can be useful in helping those servants of God who through much toil have strengthened themselves with learning and a good life and have labored so as now to help the Lord.
All right, so there, she doesn't specifically mention the mystical body of Christ as the church, but she does say, look, let's strive to be the type of person whose prayers can be useful in helping those servants. So she's talking about other servants. Later, we'll see these are preachers and theologians. They're engaged in the defense of the Catholic Church during the Reformation, and she says, we should be the type of people that pray for them. Okay, and so she's showing a kind of a differentiation in the roles that are to be taken by the sisters versus other people in the church. Okay, and she says, let us strive to be the kinds of persons. So she's talking about that spiritual perfection.
I don't think that as yet you understand well how much you owe the Lord for bringing you here where you are so removed from business affairs, occasions of sin, and worldly occupations. These persons, the preachers and theologians, must live among men, deal with men, live in palaces, and even sometimes outwardly behave as such men do. Do you think, my daughters, that little is required for them to deal with the world, live in the world, engage in its business, and, as I said, resemble it in its conversation, while interiorly remaining its strangers, its enemies, in sum, not being men but angels?
Uh, Very keen insight here. I remember from when I used to visit the Cistercian monasteries, Cistercian monks at the monastery. They told me uh, that the monk withdraws to the cloister because they can't make it in the world. It's too hard for them in the world, and the monastery makes life a lot easier. You'd think, geez, what a heroic thing to go to a monastery, but they kind of inverted that image for me and said, no, it's easier here. Okay, and this is now echoed here in Saint Teresa, who says, I don't think that you yet understand how much you owe the Lord for bringing you here, okay? And contrast that to what it's like to be living out into the world. And again, this differentiation between the different the different parts of the body, and just what the roles were of the nuns versus the theologians and preachers that were out in the world defending the church against the Protestant Reformation. Okay, so uh, the entire chapter is dedicated to this theme. So she keeps pushing the connection between the necessity for growth in spiritual strength, or sorry, in spiritual perfection, before doing battle. And she has another insight. She says, "Look, those who are going to be defending the church on the front lines, they're going to have everything thrown at them, and not only they're going to need this interior fortitude to withstand the onslaught, okay, but they really can't have any worldly attachments, because if they do, they're not going to be able to conceal those imperfections, okay, and those imperfections will then be used against them, okay, and before you even begin, like even if you were to go out on that front line and be called by God to be one of these theologians that wrote against the theologians that were for the Reformation, you better have spiritual perfection. You better have advanced along the path of spiritual perfection, because otherwise you're just going to get taken out. Okay, and so again, very insightful. All right.
And if they, the preachers and theologians, are not interiorly fortified through an understanding of the importance of trampling everything underfoot, of detachment from things that come to an end, and of attachment to eternal things, they will show some sign of this lack, no matter how much they try to conceal it. Now I wonder who it is that teaches people in the world about perfection, not so much that these people might seek perfection, but that they might condemn others. So, then, do not think that little help from God is necessary for this great battle these preachers and theologians are fighting. A very great deal is necessary.
So if you ever take a moral stance on something, your enemies are going to point out every like moment of hypocrisy. And so you could see here that there are going to be people in the world that are preaching perfection, but just so they can condemn others. All right. All right. So that ends chapter 3. Chapter 4 uh, is more starts to head towards the question of prayer. So up to chapter 3, she was Saint Teresa was locating prayer within the economy of the salvation of souls and the salvation of the church. Okay, in her historical time, but there's always turmoil. I mean, we might think our time is tumultuous, and it is. But there are always tumultuous times. There's always we're always engaged in some kind of spiritual warfare. Okay, but now she starts to turn more towards prayer and talks about prayer without ceasing. Okay. Now I have to be honest. I'm not exactly sure what she means here. Okay. And so I turned to Father Kavanaugh's comments, which seem to be rather pertinent in this regard. And so I'm just going to play his quote here that I lifted from his interpretive notes for the chapter.
Unceasing prayer, 1 These 517, to which the nuns were called also by their Carmelite rule, could not be produced through mere human effort. Teresa felt it more as a gift along with Christ's peace. Kavanaugh.
Okay, so that was a quote by Father Kavanaugh. Okay, now on this interpretation, unceasing prayer might not be something that is a mere product of our own effort. It is a gift, but that doesn't mean we can't make ourselves disposed to it. Okay, and we do that by fasts, disciplines, and silence. All right, and so here's what Saint Teresa has to say about.
Our primitive rule states that we must pray without ceasing. If we do this with all the care possible, for unceasing prayer is the most important aspect of the rule, the fasts, the disciplines, and the silence the order commands will not be wanting. For you already know that if prayer is to be genuine, it must be helped by these other things. Prayer and comfortable living are incompatible.
So, comfortable living, of course, is going to mean an attachment to that kind of a comfort, and that's going to become incompatible with prayer. So, while on the one hand, unceasing prayer is a gift, as Father Kavanaugh says, on the other hand, you can certainly stifle that gift. Okay, and so you should act in such a way as to predispose yourself to receive the gift of unceasing prayer. All right. She continues and goes on to talk about the three things that are necessary for not only peace but also to for prayer. Okay, and they are love, detachment, and humility. Okay, and so let's hear what she has to say about that.
Before I say anything about interior matters, that is, about prayer, I shall mention some things that are necessary for those who seek to follow the way of prayer. If they do not possess them, it is impossible for them to be very contemplative. The practice of these three things helps us to possess inwardly and outwardly the peace our Lord recommended so highly to us. The first of these is love for one another, the second is detachment from all created things, the third is true humility, which, even though I speak of it last, is the main practice and embraces all the others.
And so there you go. Those are the three things that we need to um, cultivate in order to predispose ourselves for prayer. Okay, and Father Kavanaugh also has another note which is very pertinent, and I'll play that for you right now.
The peace that Christ offers, and is so necessary for unceasing prayer, comes through a complete remaking of those who pray, in their relationship with others, love, charity, in their attitude towards possessions, detachment, hope, and in their attitude towards self, humility, faith. Kavanaugh.
The remainder of the chapter is actually dedicated to love. Okay, she will talk about the other things later in the text, but for the remainder of the chapter, she's really going to concentrate on love. Okay, and she begins by kind of echoing Saint Peter, which is the quote there is love covers a multitude of sins, and well, she says the following.
About the first, love for one another, it is most important that we have this, for there is nothing annoying that is not suffered easily by those who love one another. But because of either excess or defect, we never reach the point of observing this commandment perfectly.
All right, so talks about love, and it's interesting. She says, well, there's a problem if there's a deficit of love, but there's also a problem if there's an excess. And you'd say, wait, can you love too much? What does that even mean? So that's a good question. Okay, and so Saint Teresa clarifies that, and actually the remainder of the chapter. Okay, and so what is this excess love? All right, and what she's really talking about is love for other people that becomes excessive and an attachment that then detracts from God. Remember, we are called to love one another, but we ourselves are created beings. All right. And so if a love for another person begins to eclipse our love for God, well, then this becomes a problem. Okay. And this is the kind of love that St. Teresa is actually warning about. All right. And so, well, here's the next quote.
Those who are interested in perfection have a deep understanding of this excessive love, because little by little it takes away the strength of will to be totally occupied in loving God. For these great friendships are seldom directed toward helping one love God more.
All right, so there you could see what she's talking about in this excessive love. All right, and says it very clearly. It takes away strength of will. Okay, so love is an act of the will, and if this act is being directed towards a creature excessively, then it's going to be detracted. It's going to detract us from loving God. All right. So she then goes on to give some examples, and I don't know the history that well, but I can't help but suspect that she's thinking about some very particular situations that happened in her life in the various monasteries where she lived. Okay, and so she's cautioning us and warning us very sternly about the dangers of this excessive love. So let's listen to that.
It gives rise to the following: failing to love equally all the others, feeling sorry about any affront to the friend, desiring possessions so as to give her gifts, looking for time to speak with her, and often so as to tell her that you hold her dear, and other trifling things rather than about your love for God. For these great friendships are seldom directed toward helping one love God more. On the contrary, I think the devil gets them started so as to promote factions in religious orders. For when love is in the service of His Majesty, the will does not proceed with passion but proceeds by seeking help to conquer other passions.
All right, so you can see there that this excessive love can actually lead to factions. Okay, and this is a big problem. So if you think about what happens is, when you say, you have a desire to be loved, okay, and that can be manifested in a couple of ways. One way is that you desire to be loved, and the opposite of that is you fear being excluded. Okay, and so those two things together are going to create factions within a community. All right, so if you desire to be loved, well, then that's your in group, and if you fear being excluded, you don't want to be thrown into the out group. Okay, and so this inordinate love is going to create these kinds of factions within communities. Rather, what we should do is we should love all equally, and she says that to love all equally. All right, and this excessive love, what it's going to wind up doing is it's as she says, it's seldom going to lead to a greater love for God. All right, all right, let's listen to her next quote.
Let us not condescend, O daughters, to allow our wills to be slaves to anyone, save to the one who bought it with his blood. Be aware that, without understanding how, you will find yourselves so attached that you will be unable to manage the attachment. To break away from these friendships, great care is necessary at the outset of the friendship. This breaking away should be done delicately and lovingly rather than harshly.
So this paragraph really talks about the danger of enslavement, or conversely, the good of freedom, and that enslavement comes about because of these excessive friendships, excessive loves. Okay, and what I found really interesting here is her words. Okay, she says, "Without understanding how." So oftentimes our attachments will sneak in unconsciously. You won't even know that they're happening. You simply begin down a path of some kind of habit, repeated habit, and you're not necessarily conscious of this repeated habit, and then it becomes ingrained within your personality, and then you become stuck. Okay, and there's the attachment. You become enslaved to that particular thing, and that enslavement is the opposite of the kind of freedom that you should have. Now, she's talking about this in relationship to these friendships and says break them off as soon as possible, but it has her advice has ramifications beyond just the dangers of this excessive love that she's warning us about. Okay, and this attachment, it can show up later because it'll rear its ugly head in one way or another. But sometimes these attachments can persist, and you may not even know they're there. Okay, and the only way they're going to be removed is by God. And this is another example of why you really need the graces of God, because only God is going to see into the heart to discover these kinds of attachments that are going to be invisible to you. Okay, and so she said, listen to the words again, without understanding how. So a lot of these things are happening below our ability to be conscious of them. All right, let's continue. Um, uh, there was a footnote here, and I don't want to go through the entire footnote because it was actually pretty long. But you can see that St. Teresa was actually struggling to try to come up with a very good definition of love, to say, this is what you should have, and this is not the type of love that you should have, and try to generalize it and make it a more abstract definition. And the best she comes up with is, it's pretty good, but what she comes up with is that spiritual love needs to be differentiated from a love which is mixed with passion. Okay, and here's her quote there.
I want to speak now about the love that is spiritual, that which is not affected by any passion. Where passion is present, the good order is thrown into complete disorder.
Okay, so passion can sometimes mean many different things, but you could see there that passion could almost be synonymous with inordinate. So if you have some kind of inordinate love, a love which is not properly ordered, which is what inordinate means, then that inordinate love can throw everything into disorder, right? And so a love which is properly ordered, which again, ultimately culminates on God as the culminate its culmination. That properly ordered love is the spiritual love, which is fine. It's the inordinate love which is going to create disorder within the community, right? And again, typical of Saint Teresa, she actually closes off the chapter talking about confessors. Okay, again, reflecting on her own experiences with confessors, and so she has some advice about that. And her advice basically is, you're going to need good counsel. Okay, and especially, if you get into talking about these friendships, if you start to see that you're getting into one of these inordinate friendships with excessive love, founding the friendship, then you're probably going to want to break it off, and you might need some advice. Okay, so seek out the advice of a confessor. But then goes on to say, well, look, some confessors may not be good, and they may want to turn towards some vanity. And if that's the case, well, then just get yourself another confessor, if it's possible, is what she says. Okay, so let's listen to her quote here.
And if we deal with virtuous persons discreetly and moderately, especially confessors, we will benefit. But if you should become aware that the confessor is turning toward some vanity, be suspicious about everything and in no way carry on conversations with him, even though they may seem to be good, but make your confession briefly and bring it to a conclusion. And it would be best to tell the prioress that your soul doesn't get on well with him and change confessors. That would be the most proper thing to do, if you can do it without hurting his reputation. In similar cases and others as well, in which the devil could ensnare one in many difficulties and in which one does not know what counsel to take, the best thing to do is try to speak with some learned person. Make your confession to him and do what he tells you to do about the matter. Failing to provide a remedy cannot be allowed, for unless the devil is quickly cut short, the effect will not be something of minor importance when he begins to interfere. Keep in mind that this is a very important point, for such friendship is dangerous, harmful, and a hell for all the sisters. I say that you must not wait until you recognize that serious evil is present, but you should in the beginning cut the relationship short by every possible and knowable means. In good conscience you can do so.
So there's her advice, okay? And she is thinking about these inordinate friendships and very worried about them, probably because of some experiences that she's had. But then, does have that little bit of a digression into finding a good confessor to help you with this and probably other things too, okay? To nip these things in the bud. All right, so this brings us to the end. And I just kind of want to close right now with some concluding remarks of my own impression of the first four chapters, and they are my own impressions, and they don't. I don't know if it's possible even to summarize, given Saint Teresa's way of writing. Okay, because she's jumping around, it's really not possible to summarize, because summaries, tries to look for the themes which are in common, and that doesn't always happen because she does jump around the way she does. Okay, and so just bear in mind that my concluding remarks here are which I'll actually have the text to speech do for you. These concluding remarks, they are my own, but they're not at all a summary. They're just my the major takeaway from the chapter. So let's listen to that.
Closing remarks. Saint Teresa wrote The Way of Perfection for her sisters who asked her to teach them something about prayer. Surprisingly, she starts by talking about the Protestant Reformation. Just like in our times, and throughout history, the world is broken. She takes this as her launching point to locate the place of prayer in her spirituality. We transform the world by allowing ourselves to be transformed by God. But you can't do this on your own, because as fallen creatures we're broken and we wouldn't even know where to start to fix ourselves or the world. If we just act, we will wind up spreading our disorder more and not fixing anything. Like Mary's openness to God 2,000 years ago allowed him to enter the world and transform it, so now our openness to God in prayer will fix our broken world today.
All right, so there's my concluding remarks. I wrote this on Christmas Eve of 2020, but recorded it on Christmas Day. Okay, and so let me close by saying have a blessed Christmas. Bye bye.